Breaking down the best card of the year, UFC 276. This card has some of the biggest names like Israel Adesanya, Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, Sugar Sean O'Malley even, and overall this card is stacking up to be one of the best of the year. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy MMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. But anyways, let's get into it. With UFC 276 right around the corner, it's finally time to break down this card's high-profile fights. Now, this card has a ton of amazing matchups, but we're first going to start off with the main event in Israel Adesanya vs Cannonier. Now, this matchup is definitely a breath of fresh air, at least for Adesanya, as Cannonier is the first opponent that Adesanya has faced that he hasn't faced in the past in some time. Of course, besides him moving up to fight Jan Blachowicz recently. But this matchup is definitely a very interesting one, as both of these guys are obviously very good strikers. So let's start off with what Adesanya does well. So in terms of his striking, Adesanya is phenomenal, and you can definitely make the case that he's the best striker in the UFC. But in terms of his punches, Adesanya is extremely versatile. He has a really nice jab, uppercut, hook, cross. Basically, Adesanya is extremely versatile in terms of his punches, and although he looks very skinny, he of course has a ton of power, as he's definitely proven that ability in the past. But even besides his punches, Adesanya does a phenomenal job at throwing kicks as well. He does a phenomenal job at attacking his opponent's legs by consistently kicking the lower leg. He also does a pretty nice job at kicking the body, either a side kick or a front kick. He also has a phenomenal question mark kick that he utilizes pretty effectively with a left behind it, which is a very effective weapon that he has. He also has a spinning back kick. Basically, in terms of his kicks, he just can do it all, similar to his punches. But besides those two things, Adesanya also throws his knees pretty effectively and times them very well. He can throw elbows as well. In terms of his stand-up defense, it's phenomenal, and in my opinion, I think Adesanya is the hardest fighter to hit in the UFC, and I don't think it's all that close, to be honest, due to the fact that Adesanya probably has the best head movement in the entire UFC, as well as he has phenomenal footwork, and those two combined just make it so difficult to hit Adesanya, at least hit him cleanly. But besides his stand-up, Adesanya also has phenomenal takedown defense, and even when he does get taken to the ground, he does a really nice job at being able to get up as well. Now, if the fight were to go to the ground and Adesanya wasn't able to get up relatively quickly, he would probably struggle pretty significantly, as he's not known as a wrestler or a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner. But at the same time, we've really never seen that happen, so who knows how he would do on the ground, especially against an opponent like Cannonier, who's not necessarily good on the ground either. But overall, it's pretty clear that Adesanya is a phenomenal fighter, and it's going to be very difficult for Cannonier to beat him. But now let's move on to Cannonier and see what he does well. So similar to Adesanya, Cannonier is definitely a guy who does his damage on the feet and isn't necessarily known for his work on the ground. But in terms of his punches, he definitely has a pretty nice jab, straight, uppercut, hook, cross. He definitely has a lot of abilities in terms of his punches, but he also has a ton of power in his hands, which certainly has been a crucial aspect to his game. But Cannonier also does a phenomenal job at throwing those elbows and close, and throws them at perfect times, and throws them with a ton of power, which we just saw how devastating those elbows could be in his last matchup against Derek Brunson. But Cannonier also does a phenomenal job at throwing kicks and throwing them extremely hard as well, especially to the lower legs where he does a lot of his damage. So it's going to be interesting to see if Cannonier can really damage Adesanya's legs before Adesanya could damage Cannonier's legs, and if he could do so and compromise the footwork of Adesanya, maybe there could be more openings and opportunities for Cannonier to hit Adesanya. And the more that he can hit Adesanya with that power, the better chance he's going to have to win this matchup. But my official prediction for this matchup is I think Adesanya is going to keep Cannonier at distance and completely pick him apart like he does to most of his opponents. And I think Adesanya is probably going to win this matchup by decision. And when you look at the odds, Adesanya is a minus 365 favorite, which honestly, although that is a pretty big favorite, I think it's relatively justified, and it's very difficult for me to see Cannonier winning this matchup. But of course, if he were to win, he's going to need to use that power to hit Adesanya cleanly multiple times and either hurt him really badly or just completely knock him out in order to win this fight, at least in my opinion. Because if the fight goes the distance, you're probably not beating Israel Adesanya. But now let's move on to the other title fight on this card, which is Alexander Volkanovski versus Max Holloway. Now, in my opinion, I think this is the people's main event, as this is definitely a matchup that people are extremely excited for, and a very close matchup at that as well. So let's first start out with Alexander Volkanovski and see what he does well out there. So it's pretty clear that Volkanovski is a top 2 pound for pound fighter in the UFC, and I think you can easily make an argument that he's the number 1 pound for pound fighter in the UFC. And the reason he's seen as such a great fighter is he can literally do everything out there. In terms of his stand-up, he has phenomenal punches, phenomenal kicks, great elbows, knees, has really good stand-up defense, has a phenomenal chin. He's even improved upon his stand-up as of late, as we've really seen that in his last matchup against the Korean Zombie, as it seemed like his technique got better, his timing got better, his power got better, and he looked so good in that matchup against the Korean Zombie, it looked like they were not even in the same league. But of course, even besides his stand-up, Volkanovski is a phenomenal wrestler. He does a great job at finding positions and finding submissions as well, has a really nice ability to throw ground and pound shots, and honestly, I think more so than anything else, the reason why Volkanovski is so good, besides his skill obviously, is the fact that he literally refuses to give up. And we really saw that in his matchup against Brian Ortega, where he almost got choked out 2 different times, and honestly, I think basically every other fighter in the UFC probably would have tapped or probably would have went out in that same situation that Volkanovski was in. But Volk was able to get out of both of those submissions, even though they were in deep. So Max Holloway is definitely going to have his hands full in this matchup. But now let's move on to Max Holloway and see what he does well out there. Now, it's pretty clear that Max Holloway is also phenomenal in the UFC, and he certainly is a legend, but in terms of his stand-up, Max definitely has one of the best stand-ups in the entire UFC, as he might honestly be the best boxer in the UFC. I personally think it's Petr Yan in my opinion, but you certainly could make the argument that Max is the best boxer in the UFC. But in terms of his stand-up, he definitely has all the abilities in his hands, as he does have a nice jab, uppercut, cross, hook, and although Max doesn't necessarily have the most power in his hands, what he does do very effectively and what he does do very well is put a pace on whatever opponent he is fighting and eventually wear his opponent down due to that pace that he puts on them, and then he eventually hurts them in the later rounds. And we saw that in his last matchup against Yair Rodriguez, as he definitely did hurt him as the fight did go on, and we also saw this in his fights against Calvin Kattar and even Alexander Volkanovski the second time, where Max actually dropped Volkanovski in that fight. Now, in terms of Max's stand-up defense, he's definitely very good at it, as he does have phenomenal footwork, and honestly, I think he has one of, if not the best chins in the entire UFC. So it'll be very difficult for me to see Volkanovski knocking out Max Holloway. I don't really think that'll happen. Now, probably one of the biggest negatives of Max's game is the fact that he doesn't necessarily check kicks at all, honestly, and of course Volkanovski throws a pretty good kick to the lower leg, so that could potentially be an issue for Max, but he has shown in the past, even though he does take a lot of damage to his legs, that he still could fight on a damaged leg. Now, Max also has really good takedown defense, which he's definitely going to need in this matchup against Volkanovski, but when the fight does go to the ground, Max definitely has some abilities, but compared to Volkanovski, of course Volkanovski has a pretty big advantage, so Max is definitely going to look to keep the fight on the feet. But my final predictions for this fight is I think Volkanovski is going to win this matchup by decision. Now, one thing that I will say is I am a huge fan of Max Holloway, and I want Max Holloway to win this fight, but honestly, it's very difficult for me to see anybody beating Volkanovski at this point. I just think the improvements that he has made, on top of how good he already was in the past, is just going to be a handful for anybody. But if Max were to win this matchup, of course the keys for him is keep the fight on the feet and just continue to put a pace on Volkanovski and potentially even hurt him like he did in the second fight that they had. Now, the odds for this fight are extremely close, with Volkanovski being a slight -180 favorite, which in my opinion does make a lot of sense because of course his fight is very close. Although I probably made it sound like Volkanovski is going to win this matchup pretty easily, I don't think that whatsoever. I think this is going to be a very close matchup, and Max could certainly win this fight. It's just, if I had to pick a winner at this point, I definitely would pick Alexander Volkanovski, although of course I will be rooting for Max Holloway. Now, this video is only going to be about the main 2 fights on this card, and I'm going to make a separate in-depth video on Sean O'Malley's fight next Friday. But if you guys have any questions on other potential matchups on this card, feel free to ask those questions in the comments and I'll be sure to answer those. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Israel Adesanya and Alexander Volkanovski will win their respective matchups, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.